So I'm here with Brian McLaren as part of our interview series called Faith, Hope, and Love During an Election. Brian is a well-known author, activist, has been keynote speaker at several of our Writing for Your Life events. He's just a great author, great person, and someone who I really appreciate tremendously. And we're here to talk about what is going to happen here coming up and how we should look at it, how we should talk to people about it in a compassionate kind of a way, despite all the polarization that's going on. So Brian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I feel so appreciative of you and your work, and great to be with you.
So maybe to start with, why don't you give us your thoughts on kind of the country as it stands today with all of the challenges that we're facing?
Yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, if I were to say something positive, I would say that in my lifetime, more white people are waking up to the reality of white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility, all that cluster of problems that are related to our history. And we're realizing that even though we didn't choose to cause them, and we are now sort of holding the bag with responsibility for needing to address these issues and make some long needed changes. So that's the positive thing I could say. The negative thing I could say is that, I think we're in trouble. I think we are in so much trouble. And so talking about how we maintain faith, hope, and love at this time is really important, because I think we have to be involved and we have to be led by faith, hope, and love. I often think of the quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, "In fighting the monster, be careful that you do not become the monster." And this is a danger for everybody. We can lose our own spirit and our own spiritual roots in the frantic activity of sometimes super dangerous events.
That's really, really good advice. And I know I find myself, edging on the point of anger and a point of, saying things that I don't want to say.
Yeah.
And, I feel my trigger point is just like so much touchier than it used to be.
Yes. And, that I think we have to both be compassionate to ourselves in that, and also, as you say, have a certain vigilance, because the fact is we're all going through a lot. We're all living in this COVID time. We're all living in a time of political unrest, a time of factual, measurable, unprecedented division. And I'm not afraid to put my cards on the table and say that we're living in a time when I think our country is closer to, I'll say the word authoritarianism, and then I'll follow it up with fascism. I think we actually have fascist dangers in our own society right now that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And I suppose I take this extra seriously because, as you may know, Brian, I was in Charlottesville a couple of years ago, and I was part of the clergy response to the Unite the Right rally. And I will never forget the feeling of standing on a street corner and watching van after van load of young white men get out, and a few women thrown in, and march down the street carrying Confederate flags, Nazi flags, chanting Nazi slogans. The night before, seeing people carry tiki torches and baseball bats, and just thinking, this is so a lot's at stake, a lot's going on.
I'm sure seeing that in person had to be incredibly impactful and disturbing.
Yeah, it was. And I was just up the street when Heather Heyer, was a young woman protester, was hit and killed. I mean, the language I would use for it is by a white supremacist terrorist, And to add intensity to that experience, I was given access, as you may know, these right-wing authoritarian extremists do their communication through something called the dark web. And so I won't go into the details, but I was given access to read screenshots of their communications before, during, and after the rally. Yeah, it was disturbing. it was disturbing to see people celebrating this woman being killed. And yeah, it was the whole package. And then watching, our president respond with very fine people on both sides, and watching the way things have unfolded since, even up to this present day, just hearing our attorney general just say yesterday or the day before that he considers that the response to George Floyd's, being killed by a knee to his neck for 8 minutes, him saying that that's an extremist response and that, it was an overreaction, that sort of thing. I mean, it just says, I said that some white people are getting it and others aren't. And that's why I think it's really important right now for us to have these conversations, how to bring faith, hope, and love into a moment where difficult conversations really need to happen.
Wow. Yes, yes, yes. So before I ask you the next question, I want to mention this ebook that Brian has written called Why Don't They Get It? Overcoming Bias in Others and Yourself. I highly recommend it. In my courses that I have been doing online called The Business of Being a Spiritual Writer, I talk about this in every one, because the research and the insights that you provide in terms of our degrees of bias, or types of bias, are really important, I think, for people to understand. So given that as the context, in the election that we have coming up, what ways have you found to be most effective in speaking about the election with people who do not share your views?
Yes. Well, Brian, this is really an important question. And I just have to tell you, I don't think there is any simple answer. And I think what looks like a success can be a failure, and what looks like a failure can be a kind of success. And here's what I mean by that. Totally out of the realm of politics, just in the realm, I write about theology and spirituality and so on. I can't tell you the number of times I've had people say to me, Brian, I read your book, A New Kind of Christian, and I got a third of the way into it and I threw it across the room. Or somebody told me I threw it in the trash can. And I've had so many people tell me how angry they got at me when they read that book. And then I can't tell you how many people have said to me, I mean, it's just funny how similar the stories are. And then a day or two later, I thought, why is it that got to me so much? Maybe I need to take another look at it. And I went back and picked it out of the trash can and reread it. And so often the thing that we need to hear makes us mad. And often the thing that other people need to hear makes them mad. A wonderful Presbyterian minister says, pointing out division is not being divisive. And of course, we remember that one of the epithets that they used for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was that he was disruptive, and that he was what was the term? An agitator.
Yes, yes.
And so I think one of the things we have to say is there is a necessary kind of agitation. And it may be that before a person has a deep and important breakthrough in their life, they have to get angry 5 or 10 times. and the reaction, the angry reaction might be what's necessary to ever get to the place where they might listen. So I want to say that before going any further. But I think the two main things I would say in a more constructive way is to say, first, that I think we have to be willing to have the courage to differ graciously. That's my term for it. Courage to differ graciously. So that might mean you hear someone say something that you think is just false or unhelpful. They say, oh, climate change isn't real. Well, if you say, yes, it is, then you're going to get into an argument. How do you have the courage to differ graciously? So what I recommend people do is they self-differentiate. In other words, they don't say anything about you. You're wrong. You say something about yourself. Well, I really see that differently. Wow, I am convinced that it's real. And that's a non-directive statement. I'm not telling you what to do, because if I tell you what to do, you'll push back. I'm just defining myself. Wow, I see that differently. And then very often people say, well, what do you mean? And then I think if we can offer an invitation for curiosity rather than an argument back and forth, that can be helpful. Like, well, look, I'd rather not get into it right now, but if you do want to ask me sometime, I'll be glad to share with you some of the evidence that's been persuasive to me. By not doing it right now, we stay out of it being a conflict of egos. And then if a person comes back to us, we've set the rules of of engagement, so to speak. If you'd be interested, I'll be glad to share with you some of the evidence that was convincing to me. I'm not trying to convince you. I'm just sharing with you. I think it takes gentleness and subtlety, indirectness and courage to do those kinds of things, to get around the biases that you were mentioning a minute ago.
Well, you're obviously very practiced at this, which I think is really helpful. I think, that's a kind of a habit, so to speak, that takes some time for people to adopt.
I think so. I didn't have this habit always. I think I had to develop these habits because for whatever reason, I hope it's not just because I'm a jerk, but for whatever reason, I've always found myself going into spaces where I have to say things that people don't necessarily already agree with or think. And
that's because you put yourself out there, and you're not shy about saying what you believe in, and even if it risks confrontation.
It just feels it just feels inauthentic, to hear terrible things said and then to just be silent. So that's why I hope that more and more of us, even though it might be difficult, will enter into this difficult terrain, and especially between now and the election. I think that more and more of us are going to have to, especially those of us with white skin, are going to have to use our white skin to speak to other white people about needs of people who aren't white. In other words, we're going to have to try to invite and encourage other white people to say, I'm going to use my vote in not just the way that white people want it to be used. I want to use my vote to help my Black neighbor. I want to use it to help my brown neighbor, my Asian neighbor. I want to use my vote to help not just my fellow citizens, but people around the world. And not just people. I want to use my vote for the common good, which means I care about the fish in the sea and the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. So I hope that more and more of us will find ways to speak up with faith, believing that truth, that there's some power that goes with the truth, and that even though it's often opposed and trampled in the streets, that has a way of rising again, and hope that it's no time to give up, that we have to keep trying even when all the evidence is against us, and love, that whatever we love, we have to try to protect and stand up for.
Well, thanks for sharing that methodology, and I'm going to try to begin practicing that more myself. Just from more of a tactical, pragmatic view, there are lots of policy issues, right? That
yes,
we could choose to be dealing with, after the election is over. What would you recommend be the highest priorities?
Yeah, I wrote a book about this over 10 years ago called Everything Must Change. And the writing of that book, I asked a question, and my question was, what are the biggest problems in the world? And I came up with a list of 4, and every headline I've read in the last 12 or 14 years, whatever it was since I was writing that book, every headline I've read has just fit under one of these 4 categories. So it's hard for me to put any one more important than the other, because to me, they're all related. The 4 are the planet, poverty, peace, and politics and religion. The planet being, it doesn't matter what the Dow Jones Industrial Average does if we're destroying the environment. A unstable environment is going to lead to a world none of us want. And not only that, but for me as a Christian, I believe we have a God-given responsibility to care for this beautiful creation. So that's the planet. Poverty, the gap between a hyper-rich, hyper-minority and the vast majority of people is growing exponentially. And this creates a whole set of problems we don't have time to go into now. But that the problem of poverty and inequality, huge issue. If you think of it like this, somewhere, there are different estimates on this, somewhere between 6 and 23 individuals own as much wealth as half of the people in the world.
It's
And
just unbelievable.
if that doesn't
Unbelievable.
freak you out, then you think what kind of power those 6 to 23 people have. Power to buy ads, power to buy politicians, power to influence, buy lobbyists to influence policy. And you just start to realize how the rest of us are in a whole lot of trouble because of that concentration of wealth and power. So planet, poverty, peace, peace between religions, peace between races. I'm personally, the way I feel right now is I do not want America to get through this crisis and be as racist as it's been in the past. I would rather us continue in crisis and then to paste it all over and go back to the old normal. We have to get through the crisis of racism, which is just one facet, a very powerful facet of all of our problems of peace. And peace has to do with peace between individuals, peace between races, peace between religions, peace between parties, peace between nations, and ultimately it means peace between our economy and the earth, which brings us back to the planet. And then the last one's politics and religion, that our politics and religion have been so corrupted, both by similar forces, mostly by money, that they have, that politics and religion have been working for the rich and not for the rest of us. So those are my four.
Four big areas. Four important.
Yeah, but it makes it easy to vote when you have those four. It doesn't mean that any candidate is perfect, but it does mean that it helps me evaluate a candidate not based on just one issue. Because what politicians do is they divide the electorate, and each side needs something that it's good to stand for. The problem is, what do they make you swallow along with the thing that they hooked you with? And that's why I would rather develop for my own moral sense and for me, my theological sense, what the critical issues are. I'd rather start with that being clear rather than just let a politician sell me. If I could say it this way, I wish that pastors and priests and rabbis and so on of our country would help people determine what are those top four issues, whatever they might be. What are the top issues? And then, so you wouldn't let politicians tell you what you're looking for and tell you what they're selling.
Great advice. Let's dive a little bit more deeply into one of the specific issues that has been at the forefront here recently. What steps would you most like to see politicians take after the election to combat systemic racism?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would do that I wish our politicians would do is I wish they would make this almost like a war effort, meaning they bring together a whole group of people and they'd say, we want our top experts, and this group has to be inclusive of Native people, which we very quickly forget. That's where all of these problems started, when our founding fathers committed genocide, attempted genocide, and committed land theft, and put people into concentration camps. We have different words for it to hide the truth from ourselves, but so it would be a group of people. I think what we actually need is something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In fact, a Navajo friend of mine who's actually running for president, he's worth people looking at just to learn from him. His name is Mark Charles, and Mark says we can't have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because reconciliation means we used to be together, now we've been broken apart. We need truth and conciliation for the first time to come together as equals. That's what I wish would happen. And then that would lead to a period of national discussion about reparations, what reparations mean. Reparations means restoration. It means repair. It means repairing what's broken. And I think that we would be way smarter to say we're going to take a 10 or 15 or 20-year period and we are going to concentrate on this with unflagging purpose. And it won't just be government. We need our churches to focus on this and our synagogues and so on. We need our schools to focus on this. Every dimension of life, we say, we're like Germany, as if Germany never admitted it had a problem with the Nazis.
Exactly.
And it's time for the United States to face its past, face its problem, and start and decide that we're going to take what was our greatest weakness and turn it into our greatest strength. I mean, wouldn't that be an amazing thing for us to do?
It's one of the things I've been thinking about too, in that, most every other country within, the last century has had to eat some kind of humble pie.
Yes.
Whether it's Germany or Japan or
Yes.
UK with the British Empire or
Yes.
whatever, right? And
Yes.
our country maybe is on the verge of that.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it seems like that's what we need.
And that's part of what I think this election is about. It's a group of people who are saying it's time for us to be humbled as a nation. And another group of us saying, no, we're great and we're just going to be greater and there's nothing wrong with us. The only thing wrong with us is you for saying there's something wrong with us.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that might offend some people, but I have to say, I actually think that's what's going on right now. And that's why it's not easy. We all get defensive when we're confronted with our problems and failures. And so it has to be done gently and humbly. It has to be done by people who don't just say the words, but let's go back to the theme of this discussion. They have enough faith, hope, and love in their heart that they embody the message that they're trying to convey.
So for lay people out there, the general population that really doesn't have a platform per se, obviously voting is of paramount importance.
Yeah.
But what other steps can you suggest for the general population to take?
Yes. So here's what I wish. I'm involved with a wonderful group of people called the Center for Action and Contemplation. When you take action and contemplation and put them together, you have something really, really powerful and profound. And what I wish we would all get is a kind of rediscipleship or a new catechism into action and contemplation. And we would understand action involves a whole bunch of things. And we would develop a sense of here are the skill set for contemplative action. One skill set is you just keep your eyes open and you notice. And you make a commitment that when you see injustice happening, you won't walk away. You won't walk to the other side of the street, if we recall the Good Samaritan story. So there's like this personal decision to move toward need, to move toward trouble, to move toward injustice with a deep inner question, how can I be helpful in this situation? But then it goes beyond personal. By the way, part of that personal is to make relationships. There's a whole lot of white people in America who've never had a meal in a black person's home or vice versa. They've never been invited. They've never invited anybody else. What would happen if our churches said, we're going to start organizing this so we help people eat together and build relationships? What if we got churches and mosques helping Muslims and Christians learn what it's like to sit at a table together? All that's very Jesus-y stuff for me. And that's one level. And it's really important. That brings about personal and social and cultural change over time. But I also think we need to help people understand part of contemplative activism is saying probably once in your life you ought to get arrested for a good cause, meaning you're willing to get out on the streets. You're willing to put your body out, not just your words, but your body out in public to say, I care about this enough to put my body out there on the street. I think that's important. I just got an email this morning from a friend, a pastor who in Portland, Oregon, who was out on the streets last night and watched a group of mothers. You may have heard there's something called the Wall of Mothers.
Yes.
He watched a bunch of mothers have tear gas sprayed in their faces. He watched them be hit by police batons. People putting their bodies out there. I think that's important. I also think, I'll just mention there's something I call economic activism. And that's where we learn which companies are showing the most respect for the planet, which companies are showing the most respect for their employees, paying their employees a fair wage, which companies are paying attention to justice in their supply chain. And then we start to say, I'm going to start, I don't just vote with my ballot once every 4 years, but I vote with this and with this, every time I go to the store, every time I go to an online shop. And so we engage in ethical buying, and we start rewarding with we use our dollars and credit cards as ballots to vote for the companies that we think are manifesting good values, and as well as making good products and offering good services.
Lots of excellent advice, Brian. Thank you. So also part of our audience are a large number of pastors, and many of them get up many Sunday mornings between now and the election. What you recommend for them to do or say?
It's probably not a good day for me to answer this, because I'm sort of heartbroken right at this moment, partly because I'm working on a book about that deals with this to some degree, but also I just contacted an acquaintance of mine who's a megachurch pastor, and I asked him if he'd get involved speaking out on some of the key issues, and he wrote back, and here's what he said to me. He said, "I'm not going to risk losing half of my influence." And here's the irony of that. I'm not going to risk losing half my influence is to say I have influence that I don't want to use. I just don't want to lose.
Yeah.
And it just breaks my heart. So the thing I would say to pastors is, stop thinking about saving your influence. When are you saving it for? And I'd start thinking about how are you going to use it. If you try to save your influence by playing it safe, I won't address anything that will get anybody upset with me, then what you're basically saying is, I have influence to avoid influencing people. And so what I'd say is find the right way for you to influence. Maybe you ought to give some sermons about the planet, poverty, peace, and politics and religion. And I can recommend a good book that will help you learn about them if you're interested.
No, please do. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that book, Everything Must Change, that I wrote could be helpful to people.
This other one that's just coming out by Chalice Press called The House Divided.
Yes.
And it's basically a series of sermons by a pastor in Greater Denver who basically raised a lot of those issues, controversial issues in his sermons to a congregation that is politically diverse.
Well, there are just so many great books coming out right now to help pastors do this. But the ticket is they have to learn how to do that. So that's the first thing I'd say is you've got to at least use your influence to set the stage. What are the issues that people should care about? I mean, we're talking about values here. What matters, what should you love enough to keep it under consideration? I have a friend, you may know her, wonderful author, Lisa Sharon Harper.
Yeah.
And, Lisa Sharon, says to her white evangelical sisters, just remember, who you vote for will decide whether you're keeping me in mind, whether you care about me, or whether you're throwing me under the bus to just go after what you always have gone after. So that's the kind of thing pastors should be doing actively. I would say we have about 100 days to the election. Every single sermon, this is on people's minds. You should not, to quote someone famous, you should not throw away your shot at this time. And then I think pastors should find a way to speak as private citizens, because even though who you are as a private citizen affects everything you are as a pastor, if you don't allow yourself to be a human being with a voice, I'll just tell you, that's going to bite you in a lot of other areas. So I would encourage pastors to have a private Facebook page, a private Twitter, and you have to be careful. You have to model the kind of Christian behavior you want others, but do exactly what you're trying to do, Brian, in this series to help people to express themselves in a constructive way in these tough times. I think they should do that. I think some pastors need to go out right now and build relationships with candidates, because there's not just a presidential election. There's representatives for Congress and the Senate, and for state and local elections, which are really important. This would be a great time for pastors to contact campaigns and say, hey, I'd like to bring a group of 10 or 12 pastors together to tell you the things that are on our mind. And so that, because if that person is elected, you'll then have a relationship with that person, and it wouldn't hurt for you to learn something from that person. What is that person seeing? And to say, if you're somebody who cares enough to run for office, and I'm somebody who cares enough to be a pastor, we both care about our community, whatever our party, let's have a relationship and try to work for the best of our community. I mean, there's a million other things too. I'll just mention one. Right now, we've got, growing concern about police forces treating Black people and other people, non-white people, let's say, people of color, different from white people. This would be a great time for white pastors to go meet with the police chief and say, look, I'm a pastor. I care about the moral quality of this community. What can you tell me about what you're doing to make sure that our neighbors of color are being, and our Muslim neighbors and our immigrant neighbors are being treated with the respect they deserve, that I believe they deserve, because they're made in the image of God. We can get a little theology in there too.
So just to kind of look at this from an overall perspective, if you had one outcome of this election, what would you hope to see?
I'm going to be very direct. I think right now we have a multinational crime organization masquerading as a government. I think right now there's a group of oligarchs, some in Russia, some in America, some in England, some in China. We have these super rich people who are pulling the puppet strings of politicians. And what I would wish is that we would have a group of people who actually care about justice and are willing to stand up to these corrupt, I would even say criminal forces that are very much out there. Here's the irony. The way that people have been winning elections for 30 or 40 years is by all of them insulting government and saying government's a mess and government's bad. I think I would wish that we would all say, we actually, when a pandemic comes through, you actually need a good government to organize. And I wish that we had people who actually wanted good government. And maybe here's the last thing I'll say, Brian. Here's my fear. My fear is that people are choosing the politician that they think will punish their enemies the most. And that leads to very dark places. I wish we could be at a place in January of next year where we had the American people and the elected officials saying, we need good government. We need good people of good character to lead that government. Let's move forward.
So Brian, I know you're also involved in a few different organizations that are pretty active right now, particularly leading up to the election. Are there any of those that you'd like to highlight for us?
Well, the one I'd really encourage most is called Vote Common Good. And Vote Common Good is trying to invite Christians especially, but anyone who will listen, to understand voting as something that we do for the common good. And simple idea. It's an idea that all Christians should share, since Jesus told us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and since Paul told us to not only be concerned about our own interests, but also the interests of others. And the whole New Testament, the whole Bible really is a call to care about the common good. So that's probably the place I'd encourage people to go, votecommongood.com.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, Brian, thank you so much for spending time with us. I'm really excited to have you share all of these thoughts, kind of in a consolidated but comprehensive form for people to hear, because I think it's all really important.
Well, thanks. I wouldn't have had anything to say if you hadn't asked such good questions, Brian. And I'm really grateful for all the people who tune in too, because just the act of tuning in and listening says that people care. And this is the biggest thing. We just need people who pause long enough to let that faith, hope, and love well up in them to become the motivating factor in their lives.
Well, let's hope that happens. Thank you again, Brian. It's great to see you. Appreciate all of your work.
Thanks, my friend.